The city of Sydney is a big tourist draw. It spans many miles and covers many suburbs, districts and areas. It is also one of the safest cities in the world. But much of what you will see of Sydney today is the urban sprawl that was developed during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Much of the old penal colony sections of Sydney were redeveloped and redesigned, most notably because during the 19th century, a lot of these areas became sort of slums and derelict areas of the city. And in 1900, there were large cases of the bubonic plague. There are still pockets from this bygone era of the 19th century. Most of them are located on Macquarie Street, named after Lachlan Macquarie, who built the majority of the buildings on that road, and he was the 5th governor of New South Wales during the 1810s. Now he and his architect Francis Greenway, a convict himself, were instrumental in the early urban development of Australia and of Sydney itself. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, and let's get straight on it. Macquarie began his tenureship as governor of this colony on the 1st of January 1810, and he was arriving to a rather unstable situation. The previous governor was William Bligh. Now he is most famous for being the captain of the HMS Bounty, whose crew mutinied against him in 1789. Now in 1808, the same thing happened. The New South Wales Corps, who were the main military force in Sydney, mutinied against their governor, stripped him of his responsibilities and put him in prison. So from 1808 until Macquarie's arrival, there was a military rule within Sydney. When Macquarie arrived in 1810, the New South Wales Corps were quite happy for this new governor to arrive, and he was accepted quite quickly. One of the first major plans by Governor Macquarie was the construction of the Sydney Hospital. The main medical facilities in Sydney had not really changed since the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788. They were a bunch of tents and prefabricated structures located on George Street, which is now the Orient Hotel. So Macquarie put in an application to the British government asking them for funding and the means to construct this new hospital. But the government flat out refused, and refused on all occasions for all of the new major buildings in Australia at that time. They believed that being a penal colony, Sydney should be about punishment and hard graft. This wasn't about constructing a new free settlement for the British Empire. This was about punishing those who had committed crimes against the British public and against the British Crown as well. Macquarie then went down the private route, getting in some private contractors, and on the basis that convict labour would be used to construct this new hospital. But when going down the private route, one must always be careful of shoddy cowboy builders. Because by 1815 and the supposed completion of the hospital, Francis Greenway was attached to the project, and he noted that certain wings were structurally unsafe and that corners were being cut during the construction period. So he and various other architects and builders over the next 10 years, right up until 1826-27, were redesigning the hospital, making sure that this hospital wasn't just going to collapse in on itself. The first patients were admitted by 1816 as this redesigning was going on, and even by 1980, when restorers were doing their works to the hospital, they were still finding the examples of this shoddy work from all the way back in 1811 to 15. Now originally the hospital was known as the Rum Hospital, until about 1880, when it was given a proper name, more suitable name. It was called the Rum Hospital because the builders and contractors were given the monopoly on all of the rum imports that were coming into Sydney. So it's not too much of a stretch to consider that perhaps these builders and contractors were drunk half the time and probably didn't really care about the construction of the hospital. They only cared about the imports and the monopoly that they had, that they were getting from that. Now, although the hospital still stands on the same position that it did in 1811, the roles and purposes of certain wings and certain areas of this building have changed over the last 200 years. You have the Parliament building and you have the Mint Museum as well. But this building could have been lost to the test of time by the late 1930s and early 40s. In 1935, there was a proposal to build a giant complex of law courts on the Sydney Hospital, Parliament House and Mint Museum area, that whole section of the street. But thanks to the Second World War, the plans were scrapped and the buildings have remained intact ever since. Now, Francis Greenway, who was the main architect of this urbanisation of early Sydney, arrived at the colony on the May of 1814, due to start a 14-year sentence at the penal colony. There are a list of buildings attributed to the architect Francis Greenway, listed on a giant plaque on the floor, on the edges of the Hyde Park and at the bottom of Macquarie Street. The list includes lighthouses, government buildings, law courts, barracks and even churches, all constructed within a 5 or 6 year period between 1815 and 1821. Now, this remarkable man, who is attributed to creating the early form of the modern day urbanised Sydney, is remarked by Lachlan Macquarie with great praise. And in a quote that is attached to the plaque on the edge of Hyde Park, it is said, "When he reflects that until the arrival of Mr. Greenway, there was no architect in the colony, and great as his talents are, he had had many difficulties to contend with. The Governor feels both pride and exultation in having been enabled to complete in so short a time so many useful, handsome and important buildings." Francis Greenway was pardoned for his crimes on the 16th of December 1817, after the successful construction of the new Macquarie Lighthouse at the south head of Port Jackson. Now, unfortunately, this lighthouse doesn't exist anymore because a new one was constructed in the 1880s. Now, either side of this giant plaque dedicated for Francis Greenway are the Hyde Park Barracks, which were constructed between 1817 and 1819 and is one of the oldest set of barracks from that era, and St James's Church, which is one of the last constructed buildings attributed to Francis Greenway. Construction of the church began in 1820 and lasted until about 1824, by which point Francis Greenway was no longer the architect for the government. In 1821, Greenway and Macquarie had had a slight falling out. Macquarie was already going through a slightly tumultuous period in his governorship. His leadership and his actions as governor were being questioned by the British government, and an auditor had been sent to survey the situation of the legislation of Australia. Now, despite trying to resign many times in the last couple of years of his governorship, Macquarie was replaced by a man called Thomas Brisbane, who had no love for Francis Greenway at all, and so sacked the architect in 1822. Unfortunately, in the last 15 years of his life, up until his death in 1837, Francis Greenway was never commissioned to project any architectural plans. And so when he died, he was in a very poor and destitute position. Where he is buried is rather a mystery, because his grave was left unmarked and unknown. Now, despite the faults of Governor Macquarie as a leader, and perhaps as a person as well, he did bring about a new social change within Australia. He introduced a new standardised currency, whereas before this point, the currencies of the Port Jackson colony had been an amalgam of French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and of course British currencies alike. He also opened up the Botanical Gardens in 1816. It had once been an agricultural hub for this new colony in 1788, but was repurposed as the Botanicals by Governor Macquarie, with a new wall, known as Macquarie's Wall, dividing the points between the government sections and the convict sections of the new colony. Not much of the wall still survives, but you can see it here in this little clip. And one of the first things that Governor Macquarie did in 1810 was sanction a 3-day social event filled with carnivals and entertainment, balls and dinners alike, organised by the 73rd Regiment. And it was held at Hyde Park, which between 1810 and 1826 was a proper horse racing course, standardised and set out like many of the famous European courses. Even in fault, Governor Macquarie's actions during his time as governor would bring about a new legislative council by 1824, headed still by the governor, Thomas Brisbane, but it was a more sophisticated and pragmatic form of government than the one-man rule that had been since 1788. What is more, after Governor Macquarie's time, free settlers were allowed to come and emigrate to Sydney in Australia and start a new life for themselves. There was still going to be the penal colony aspects for Sydney, and other various penal colonies were going to be set along the eastern coastline. But free settlement, for the first time in the colony's short history, people were going to emigrate and live a new life in Australia. To sum up, Governor Macquarie's time as governor is still highly regarded amongst the settling communities of Australia. And on a statue that was erected in 2013, there is a quote that remarks that Macquarie was a perfect gentleman, a Christian and supreme legislator of the human heart. This government was more ratified by his own merits than by his official insignia. A new chapter was about to begin for the Australian people, starting in 1821, thanks to the urbanising plans of Governor Macquarie and his architect, Francis Greenway. Now finally, before I conclude this week's video, I want to take you to Mrs. Macquarie's Point. Just off the Botanical Gardens and up a small little road known as Mrs. Macquarie's Road, of course. It is the most favourite spot of Mrs. Macquarie to view the magnificent harbour that is surrounding Sydney. She could admire the landscapes and be away from the hustle and bustle of the construction works being done by her husband, the governor. A small little chair, it's actually quite a large chair actually, is set within the stone and completed by about 1816 and has a small little inscription underneath it, remarking it as Mrs. Macquarie's chair. And whilst Sydney has changed quite a lot in the 200 years since, you can still admire the harbour from Mrs. Macquarie's Point. You can see the Sydney Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You can admire the metropolis of Sydney in itself, and you could still take in the sunsets of an Australian evening. See you next week, folks.